particular difficulty was the elastic lining of the contractile balloon. He found he needed a new substance, and in the discovery and manufacture of that new substance he had, as he never failed to impress upon the interviewers, performed a far more arduous work than even in the actual achievement of my seemingly greater discovery. But it must not be imagined that these interviews followed hard upon Filmer's proclamation of his invention. An interval of nearly 5 years elapsed, during which he timidly remained at his rubber factory. He seems to have been entirely dependent on his small income from this source, making misdirected attempts to assure a quite indifferent public that he had invented what he had invented. He occupied the greater part of his leisure in the composition of letters to the scientific and daily press, and so forth, stating precisely the net result of his contrivances and demanding financial aid. That alone would have sufficed for the suppression of his letters. He spent such holidays as he could arrange in unsatisfactory interviews with the doorkeepers of leading London papers. He was singularly not adapted for inspiring hall porters with confidence, and he positively attempted to induce the War Office to take up his work with him. There remains a confidential letter from Major General Volleyfire to the Earl of Frogs. "The man's a crank, and a bounder to boot," says the Major General in his bluff, sensible army way, and so left it open for the Japanese to secure, as they subsequently did, the priority of this side of warfare, a priority they still, to our great discomfort, retain. And then, by a stroke of luck, the membrane Filmer had invented for his contractile balloon was discovered to be useful for the valves of a new oil engine, and he obtained the means for making a trial model of his invention. He threw up his rubber factory appointment, desisted from all further writing, and, with a certain secrecy that seems to have been an inseparable characteristic of all his proceedings, set to work upon the apparatus. He seems to have directed the making of its parts, and collected most of it in a room in Shoreditch, but its final putting together was done at Dymchurch in Kent. He did not make the affair large enough to carry a man, but he made an extremely ingenious use of what were then called the Marconi rays to control its flight. The first flight of this first practicable flying machine took place over some fields near Burford Bridge, near Hythe in Kent, and Filmer followed and controlled its flight upon a specifically constructed motor tricycle. The flight was, considering all things, an amazing success. The apparatus was brought in a cart from Dymchurch to Burford Bridge, and ascended there to a height of nearly 300 feet, swooped thence very nearly back to Dymchurch, came about in its sweep, rose again, circled, and finally sank uninjured in a field behind the Burford Bridge Inn. At its descent a curious thing happened. Filmer got off his tricycle, scrambled over the intervening dike, advanced perhaps 20 yards towards his triumph, threw out his arms in a strange gesticulation, and fell down in a dead faint. Every one could then recall the ghastliness of his features, and all the evidence of extreme excitement they had observed throughout the trial, things they might otherwise have forgotten. Afterwards, in the inn, he had an unaccountable gust of hysterical weeping. Altogether there were not 20 witnesses of this affair, and those for the most part uneducated men. The new Romney doctor saw the ascent but not the descent, his horse being frightened by the electrical apparatus on Filmer's tricycle, and giving him a nasty spill. 2 members of the Kent Constabulary watched the affair from a cart in an unofficial spirit, and a grocer calling round the Marsh for orders, and 2 lady cyclists seemed almost to complete the list of educated people. There were 2 reporters present, one representing a Folkestone paper, and the other being a 4th-class interviewer and symposium journalist, whose expenses down, Filmer, anxiously as ever for adequate advertisement, and now quite realizing the way in which adequate advertisement may be obtained, had paid. The latter was one of those writers who can throw a convincing air of unreality over the most credible events, and his half-facetious account of the affair appeared in the magazine page of a popular journal. But, happily for Filmer, this person's colloquial methods were more convincing. He went to offer some further screed upon the subject to Banghurst, the proprietor of the New paper, and one of the ablest and most unscrupulous men in London journalism, and Banghurst instantly seized upon the situation. The interviewer vanishes from the narrative, no doubt very doubtfully remunerated, and Banghurst himself, double chin, grey twill suit, abdomen, voice gestures, and all, appears at Dymchurch, following his large, unrivaled journalistic nose. He had seen the whole thing at a glance, just what it was and what it might be. At his touch, as it were, Filmer's long-pent investigations exploded into fame. He instantly and most magnificently was a boom. One turns over the files of the journals of the year of 1907 with a quite incredulous recognition of how swift and flaming the boom of those days could be. The July papers know nothing of flying, see nothing in flying, state by a most effective silence that men never would, could, or should fly. In August, flying and Filmer, and flying and parachutes and aerial tactics, and the Japanese government and Filmer, and again flying, shouldered the war in Yunnan and the gold mines of Upper Greenland off the leading page. And Banghurst had given £10,000, and further Banghurst was giving £5,000, and Banghurst had devoted his well-known, magnificent, but hitherto sterile, private laboratories and several acres of land near his private residence on the Surrey hills to the strenuous and violent completion, Banghurst fashion, of the life-size practicable flying machine. Meanwhile, in the sight of privileged multitudes in the walled garden of the Banghurst town residence in Fulham, Filmer was exhibited at weekly garden parties, putting the working model through its paces. At enormous initial cost, but with a final profit, the New paper presented its readers with a beautiful photographic souvenir of the first of these occasions. Here again the correspondence of Arthur Hicks and his friend Vance comes to our aid. "I saw Filmer in his glory," he writes, with just the touch of envy natural to his position as a poet passé. "The man is brushed and shaved, dressed in the fashion of a Royal Institution afternoon lecturer, the very newest shape in frock coats and long patent shoes, and altogether in a state of extraordinary streakiness, between an owlish great man and a scarred, abashed, self-conscious bounder cruelly exposed. He hasn't a touch of color in the skin of his face, his head juts forward, and those queer little dark amber eyes of his watch furtively round him for his fame. His clothes fit perfectly, and yet sit upon him as though he had bought them ready-made. He speaks in a mumble still, but he says, you perceive indistinctly, enormous self-assertive things. He backs into the rear of groups by instinct if Banghurst drops the line for a minute, and when he walks across Banghurst's lawn one perceives him a little out of breath and going jerky, and that his weak white hands are clenched. His is a state of tension, horrible tension. And he is the greatest discoverer of this or any age. The greatest discoverer of this or any age. What strikes one so forcibly about him is that he didn't somehow quite expect it ever, at any rate, not at all like this. Banghurst is about everywhere, the energetic MC of his great little catch, and I swear he will have everyone down on his lawn there before he has finished with the engine. He had bagged the Prime Minister yesterday, and he, bless his heart, didn't look particularly outsized on the very first occasion. Conceive it! Filmer! Our obscure, unwashed Filmer, the glory of British science! Duchesses crowd upon him, beautiful, bold peeresses say in their beautiful, clear, loud voices, "Have you noticed how penetrating the great lady is becoming nowadays? Oh, Mr. Filmer, how did you do it?" Common men on the edge of things are too remote for the answer. One imagines something in the way of that interview. Toil ungrudgingly and unsparingly given, madam, and perhaps, I don't know, but perhaps a little special aptitude. So far, Hicks and the photographic supplement to the New paper is in sufficient harmony with the description. In one picture the machine swings down towards the river, and the tower of Fulham Church appears below it through a gap in the elms, and in another Filmer sits at his guiding batteries, and the great and beautiful of the